Grace, mercy, and peace from God our Father, and from our Lord and Savior Jesus the Christ. Amen. A hurricane strikes the island of Haiti. The hearts of the world go out to the people affected. And at the same time, a voice is heard. This is God's judgment on Haiti for their sin and their wickedness. A hurricane strikes the city of New Orleans, and our nation's heart goes out to them. And yet a voice is heard. This is God's judgment on that city for Mardi Gras, for all of that filth that takes place on Bourbon Street. The World Trade Center is attacked, and our nation's heart breaks. And in the midst of that, a voice is heard. This is God's judgment on that city for the greed and the usury of those financial institutions located there. AIDS becomes an epidemic that afflicts not just our nation, but our world. And everyone weeps. And yet a voice is heard. This is God's judgment on people who use IV drugs illegally and who engage in extramarital relations. When disaster, when tragedy strikes, there are people who are quick to jump to an explanation and to lay blame. That's not just a modern occurrence. It happened in Jesus' day. A group of Galileans slaughtered by the Romans, and their blood actually mixed with the sacrifices in the temple. It must be God's judgment on them. The tower in Siloam falls and kills people. It must be judgment. When disaster strikes, we're hurt and we are confused. And we go grasping to begin to understand what's happening. We need an explanation. We need an explanation that helps us begin to deal with whatever has occurred. And all too often the explanation is judgment. That's why these bad things are happening to people. And along with that explanation of judgment comes blame. They did something wrong. That's the default. We need an explanation when something tragic and horrific happens, because it makes us feel better. It helps us to feel that there is some kind of a reason why this is happening. A logical reason must be behind it. And by placing blame, well, then we really make ourselves feel better, because you know what? I'm not as bad as they are. I'm not doing the horrible thing that they're doing, so me and my loved ones were safe from those kinds of tragedies. Those disasters, those bad things aren't going to happen to me and the people that I love. Or so we like to fool ourselves. Tragedy, disaster, those bad things, they don't just happen to other people. June 15th, 1904. Do you know the date? June 15th, 1904. And don't go looking at Dr. Hillis or Pastor Nicolene, because neither one of them were around then either. Gentlemen, I apologize. June 15th, 1904. The paddle ship General Slocum is traveling up the Hudson River. On board are 1,432 souls. During the trip up the river, the boat catches fire. Of those 1,432 souls on board, 1,021 die. The largest civilian mass casualty event in the continental United States from its founding until September 11, 2001. And what horrible sin had those wicked people committed? Do you know? The boat was traveling from Little Germany in New York up the Hudson River to a campground for a picnic. The occupants? The members of St. Mark's Lutheran Church. Tragedy does not just strike other people. Bad things do not just happen to others, they happen to us as well. And when they happen to us, it's not judgment, we don't blame, we say it's a senseless tragedy. Our own loved ones get sick, sometimes terminally ill, and they're taken far too soon. Sometimes it's the young, healthy person who's always lived a good, healthy life and always been a good person. Sometimes it's the middle-aged person of faith who's been in church every Sunday their entire life. And when bad things happen to them, we're a lot slower to blame. It's a tragedy. It's senseless. The truth is, disaster, tragedy, evil affects the entire world. It's not just those people over there because they're such horrible sinners. It happens to everybody. It happens to you and to me. And it happens because of sin. Because sin is real. And sin affects us, and it affects all of creation. I've had people ask me, Pastor, why do we have hurricanes that cause damage and loss of life? Why do we have tornadoes, earthquakes, wildfires, tsunamis, drought, plague, pestilence? Why do all these things happen? Sin. And no, not someone sinned and God sent this tragedy upon them as God's judgment. No, because sin is real, and sin, just like sin affects us. When God created Adam and Eve, He looked at them, He said they were good. And remember, when God says good, He means perfect. In the beginning, they were perfect. But after sin entered the world, the perfect bodies that God created for us, well, they're not so perfect anymore. We need glasses. We get overweight. And all manner of illness strikes us that did not happen in the garden. It happens to us because of sin. In the same way, creation itself is sick because of sin. And all these disasters, these tragedies, these are voiceless evils that occur in nature because sin is real and affects it too. Sin is real, it affects creation, it affects us. And it affects us all equally. We can't point to others when bad things happen to them and blame them. What happens when you point your finger at somebody? One finger pointing at them. Where are these three pointing? Right back at yourself. Jesus says, do you think those Galileans who had their blood mingled with the sacrifices, were they so horrible, so worse? No. Those people who had the Tower of Siloam fall on them, were they worse than other people in Jerusalem at that time? No. No one who suffers tragedy, loss, disaster is any worse than anyone else. We're all sinners. We are. We're all that tree in that parable that Jesus talks about, that fig tree. A tree with such promise. We have that same promise too in our baptism. A life dedicated to God in Christ Jesus and all the promises. Do you renounce sin? Do you renounce the devil? We make those promises. I renounce them, I renounce them, I renounce them. We stand here as young adults to make our confirmation. Do you renounce the devil, all the forces of evil? And we gladly promise, I renounce them. Husbands and wives stand here as well, make promises to God and to one another. Like the tree, we have such promise. But the fruit we bear, sometimes it's really good. But there are times also when it does not live up to the promise. And so Jesus' parable about this fig tree that is not bearing fruit, it's a warning for us too. God calls on us, expects us as His children to bear the fruit that we promise. And too often, we fail. And we should rightly, like that tree, be cut down, be cast away. But God does not cut you down. He does not cast you away. Instead, He cut down His own Son and cast Him away to suffer hell itself for you. For you. Instead of cutting down your tree and mine, God took His Son Jesus and nailed Him to the tree of the cross. To pay for all the times that we did not bear the fruit that we have promised. That did not bear the fruit that God rightly expects from us. Jesus suffered and died for you. And now you are forgiven. You are forgiven. By baptism, joined to Christ Jesus. And all the fruits of His life, all the fruit that He bore, is yours. His sinless, His righteousness, yours. His perfect obedience to God, yours. All of the fruits that He bore during His life, you get the credit for them. And in Christ Jesus, God is well pleased with you. Calamity, disaster, evil happens. It happens in our world. It is not God's judgment, God's punishment, and no one is to blame. God doesn't do that. God doesn't mete out His punishment on people, because Jesus bore all the punishment on the cross. And in Him, you are forgiven. And with you, God is well pleased. May the peace of God, which passes all understanding, guard and keep your hearts and minds through faith in Christ Jesus unto life everlasting. Amen.